started. Yes, thanks again for joining us. This is our second webinar on our proposed 2021 registry fees for tires, batteries, and electronics. I'm Jess Turquette. I'm the communications advisor at our PRA. With me today is Noah Gitterman, our registrar and general counsel. We also have Holly LaFontaine on the line just for support on questions if needed. So today we'll be going through our proposed fees, as well as answering any questions that you may have about them, and also looking for your feedback through this session as well. Next slide, please. So to ask a question, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the system, but just in case, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So click on that and type your question in there and click send. We will be pausing throughout the presentation to address your questions. There is an option here to upvote or like a question. So you can use that when you see somebody else type in a question that you would like to see answered. So you give it a thumbs up. That will bump the question up the queue, and it will hopefully get us to answer it a little bit quicker. On that same note, if we are unable to answer your questions today because of if we run out of time, or maybe your question is a little bit more specific to your individual business needs, we will likely follow up with you after the webinar. So no questions will go unanswered. We hope to get to all of them in the session itself, but sometimes time doesn't always allow for that. Also, as always, we will be, this is being recorded right now, this webinar, so we will be posting the recording to our website later this afternoon, as well as the recording from yesterday's session and the presentation slides. So that will be all available by end of day today, and we'll be sending an email out to participants, letting them know that they are posted. Next slide, please. Quickly just going through the agenda. It's a shorter agenda, but first we'll just kick off with speaking about the authority, who we are, and our finances, just a little quick background, and then we'll dive right into the proposed 2020 registry fees for tires, batteries, and electronics. At the end, we'll just close a loop of next steps of how you can submit feedback or any questions to us, as well as what to expect when the fees are finalized. So with that, I will hand it over to Noah Gitterman to lead the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. So I'm going to start, I think we always start these consultations with a review about who the authority, or Ripra, you'll hear me calling us Ripra every so often, who we are and what we do. So we're the regulator that is mandated by the government to administer two statutes, the RRCEA and the WDTA. And under the WDTA, we oversee the wind up and transition of waste diversion programs being run by IFOs and ISOs. And then under the RRCEA, we implement new resource recovery regulatory frameworks focused on individual producer responsibility. To date, we've overseen the transition of 3 programs. The used tire program transitioned at the beginning of 2019. Batteries transitioned the middle of 2020, and the E program just transitioned at the start of this year. So in each of these programs, regulated entities are required to register and report with the authority through our registry system. And the registry system is an online platform that allows us to collect the information we need to collect under those regulations. And for the batteries and e-programs, the full online registry is still being built for the TIRES program. Their part of the registry is already up and running. So next slide, please. A little bit about our finances, just to provide some context for why we're doing fee setting. So under our statutes, as an administrative authority, we don't receive any government funding for our operations. So all of our funds, and we don't receive revenues from any other source. So all of our funds or all of our expenses are funded through fees that we charge to the entities we regulate on a cost recovery basis. And we recover fees under both the WDTA and the RRCEA. Under the WDTA, there are monthly cost recovery charges to the industry funding organizations and stewardship organizations we oversee. Under the RRCEA, we have annual, or at least for the programs we have to date, there are annual fees that producers pay when they register and report to us as they're required to under the regulations. Our WDTA charges go to cover the costs that we incur in overseeing and transitioning those programs, winding them up. And under the RRCEA, the charges or the fees we set cover the costs of running the new resource recovery programs under the RRCEA. There are rules in our legislation related to setting and collecting fees. And in particular, we are required to consult on fees, on our proposed fees before they are set. And then once they are set, which is done by our board of directors, the fees need to be posted for 30 days before they finally take effect. So that's a bit of background. If you have more questions about that, we can, we'll have time in the Q&A session later. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a bit about our approach to setting fees, RRCA fees for 2021. So what we're consulting on now are fees for the TIRES program and the Batteries and E program. So the producers, our proposal, just like in 2020, is that the producers in those programs will be paying fees to the authority to cover 2021 program costs. And those will get collected when producers come in to report their 2021, to report their supply that they're required to report in 2021, which will be for a previous year. We expect that there will be additional RRCA programs coming online in 2021. In particular, we anticipate a final hazardous and special products, what I'll be referring to as HSP reg in 2021, and we anticipate a final blue box regulation in 2021. And with both of those regulations, what we expect, and this is based on the drafts that are out for public consultation, is that there will be registration and reporting under both of those regulations. And so we expect that we'll be collecting fees from the producers obligated under those regulations as well. Typically what we've done in the past is when we've consulted on fees, we presented an updated budget for the year and how we're allocating that budget among the RRCA programs. I think that this year we'll also likely be consulting on some updates to our fee setting policy and methodology, just so it appropriately reflects our current approach to setting fees. And those policies right now are on our website, but are due for an update. That whole process, though, of reviewing our budget and how we're allocating that budget to each of the programs needs to wait until the HSP and Blue Box regulations are finalized, because that exercise requires us to look at all the operational RCA programs at once. And we can't do that till we know what the programs are, and we won't know what the programs are until we get final regs from the ministry. So that broader consultation will be happening later this year, and you'll all be invited to that as well. Right now, we're focused on tires fees and batteries and fees. And our proposed approach for tires and batteries and given the uncertainty about the full scope of the RCA programs in 2021 right now, is that we will charge the same fees to those programs that we charged in 2020. And if you could go to the next slide. We'll get into some of the details in a minute, but to give you, just to provide some background or context for what the proposal is, we're looking to set fees on producers. So just like in 2020, there will be no fees for service providers or pros. And as I mentioned, what we're proposing is that the fee for tires and for batteries and electronics be based on the fee from 2020, plus an adjustment for surplus or deficit from the previous year. So for the tires program, there is no material surplus or deficit from 2020. So the fee will be essentially the same fee as it was last year, but without any surplus or deficit carryover. For batteries and electronics, the fee will be the same as last year, but with an adjustment for a deficit from 2020 that is essentially a result of Ripra under collecting from the 2020 registrations what we expected to collect. And that's primarily due to the volume of material, or the total kilograms of material being that has been reported into the registry being less than what we expected it to be when we set the fee in 2020. So because of that, because of the lower volumes reported, we under collected compared to what we thought we would in 2020, and so we'll catch that up in 2021. So that's our approach for setting variable fees. And again, we're doing that in part because the full sort of budget setting process will happen later in the year. There are some changes we are proposing to what we call the de minimis threshold, or the flat fee for batteries and electronics. And I'll get into that a bit later. But that's essentially being done in order to kind of rationalize our approach to the de minimis or flat fee across all of our programs, including tires and what we expect to happen with HSP and Blue Box. So because we're setting fees for tires and batteries and electronics without doing the full sort of budget allocation analysis, it may turn out that we that the budget that ends up getting allocated to those programs is not exactly the same as what we expect will collect through the fees that we're setting right now. And so any differences will get trued up in the 2022 fee setting process. that's similar to how we always operate our programs. So operate the fee setting process. So when we set fees in one year, surpluses or deficits are then carried over to the next year. And so the same process will happen this time. We don't expect, based on what we know of the, at least what we expect right now of the HSP and Blue Box regs, we don't expect there to be a big difference between what we'll collect through the fees we're setting right now and what the final budget process will lead us to. So we don't expect there to be a need for a substantial true up when we get to the 2022 fee setting process. And so it'll just be, what we expect is it'll just be similar to how we true up in the normal course from year to year when there's a difference between budget and actuals. So maybe go to the next slide and we'll get into some of the details, and obviously you'll have a chance to ask questions if I'm being unclear. So these are the fees we're proposing for the tires program. As in 2020 and previous years, for small producers, there's a $75 flat fee. For other producers, it's a per tire fee. And so we're proposing that the fee be 13.5 cents in 2021. That's the same as it was in 2020. Sorry, that's the same as it was in 2020, but without any surplus or deficit carryover. So the actual invoiced amounts that tires producers paid in 2020 was a couple of cents less per tire, and that's because there was a substantial surplus that was carried over from 2019. There is no surplus to carry over from 2020, so there's no adjustment to the fee, and we're proposing to leave it at 13.5 cents per tire. Next slide, please. This is our proposal for the batteries and electronics fee. So I'll start just with the variable fee. So the fee that was set in 2020 was 3.4 cents per kilogram. And again, we're proposing to use that same fee as the fee for 2021. We need to account for the deficit from the 2020 collection. And what we expect is that that will increase the per kilogram fee up to 4.5 cents per kilogram. And I say what we expect because we are still getting some registrations in and invoices out on to batteries and e-producers. And so to the extent that that deficit comes down between now and when final fees are set in the middle of May, that number will come down. So the basic concept is that we are setting a 3.5–4 cent per kilogram fee plus the wherever the estimated deficit is as of the date when the final fees are set, which will be in the middle of May when this comes to our board for approval. There are, as I mentioned, there are some changes to the de minimis thresholds for batteries and E. And so what we've done is align the thresholds themselves to the exemption thresholds that are in the regulations. So there was some difference between the thresholds that we had set in 2020 and what was in the regulations. I think part of that was due to the fact that the regulation was finally approved very close to when we needed to approve final fees. And I think some of the misalignment may have been the result of that timing crunch. So we're aligning the thresholds with the exemptions in the regs, and then proposing a $75 flat fee for producers that fall below those thresholds. So those will be producers that have supply volumes that are under the exemptions, but still need to register. So for example, under it might be because they're taking advantage of reductions that put them under the exemption threshold. So they still need to register. Or specifically in the case of batteries, it may be because even though they're under the threshold, they have more than, I think the rule is 5 full-time employees, so still need to register. And so to rationalize this de minimis fee with what we do in tires and what we're expecting, at least for HSP and Blue Box, we're proposing a $75 flat fee for those registrants. So those are the details of the proposal. And I think now I can turn it over to Jess to field questions.
We have a couple of questions that have come in. So one is regarding kind of the fee payment timeline. The question is, the fees that were paid in 2021, so this year, were those not for 2021 costs?
They were not. They were for 2020 program costs. So part of the reason some of those fees for ITTAV and batteries got paid in 2021 is because we decided to extend the registration timeline, which had been set for November 2020. And because there wasn't a lot of time between the final reg and that registration deadline, which was set in the regulation, we allowed folks to come in later. I think we communicated a January 31st registration deadline to give people more time to gather the information they needed. So that whole registration campaign that concluded in the first part of this year related to 2020 obligation, essentially. And so there will be another reporting campaign for batteries and ITTAV in 2021. We haven't announced when that's going to happen. So it will likely, again, not be on the timelines in the regulation, which I think would actually have it happening at the end of this month. But we are in the process of getting the online registry built for batteries and ITTAV, and we think it would be much easier for users to interact with our online registry. And so we're holding off that registry or reporting campaign until we hope the registry will get built, and then the fees will get paid at that time. So that will happen later this year.
And just a follow up to that, maybe you can speak to the person's asking, but the recycling program or the regulation didn't kick in until January 1st of this year. So what were those, what are the fees covering for 2020?
Right, so for 2020, they are covering all of the work we needed to do to get the program up and running and to do the initial registration and reporting for the program. And that's consistent with how we approached fees for the tires program. So the tires folks had initial registration and reporting deadline in 2018, even though their program transitioned starting in 2019. And just like with ITTAV and batteries, the tires folks paid RCA fees in 2018, and then again on an annual basis in 2019 and onward.
Yeah. Next question, why have flat fees tiered to producer size been rejected in favor of per kilogram for battery need? It would provide a more stable funding mechanism.
That's a good question. I think historically, a variable per kilogram fee has been at least what Ripra and our board has thought is the fairest approach to fee setting. But if there are, you know, if our regulated entities, our stakeholders have ideas for other approaches to setting this fee, we'd be interested in hearing those proposals.
Thank you, Noah. Next question. What's the rationale to hold the producer responsible for the recycling fees and not the service providers under the E program? The producers are not installing any units and not in the loop of the recycling take-back process. The producers are left out of the loop after the sales of the units to the service providers.
So that's a decision that Ripra has made based on the fundamental structure underlying the RCA and these resource recovery regulations, which is that it's a producer responsibility framework. So even though the producers are hiring service providers, pros, processors, haulers, to help them achieve their obligations, the fundamental obligation is on the producer. And that's why Ripra has decided to set to have the producers cover Ripra's costs of operating the program.
Thank you. Next question. Why are we charging the fees at the time, why pay recycling fees at the time of sales, importation, instead of at the time of disposal?
So I'm going to assume that's a question about just the Ripra fee, not the total cost of producers' resource recovery obligations. So we set the fee based on the supply that gets reported into our registry each year. And that number is actually a historical number. So I forget exactly how it works out in each of the regs, but it's either the supply from the previous year or 2 years prior, or I think maybe even some cases 3 years prior. And that's the supply number that sets the management target for that producer. And so that's what we use to set the fee.
Okay, thank you. Now, yeah, if for this person who wrote that question, and if you had a different meaning or wanted to get a different response, please type in another question. We'll be happy to answer that. Will OES and Stewardship Ontario, so will OES electronic surplus and Stewardship Ontario battery surpluses from the previous programs be applied to 2021 fees?
So that's a good question. For the OES program, the OES wind-up plan directs that any residual funds left over from the fee elimination they implemented and whatever their wind-up costs might be will come to Ripra for the specific purpose of offsetting ITTAV fees. And so a question of whether what that total amount will be, and whether it can be used to cover the 2021 fees depends in part on actions that the OES liquidator will take, and how quickly they can get through that. So if those if those residual funds come into Ripra in time in 2021, we'll likely have a consultation just to confirm our approach to how we'll apply them to ITTAV fees, and that will be available to producer registrants. On batteries, I'm less certain of the status of the surplus, so I can, whoever's asking that question, we can get back to you and let you know.
Right, yeah, we'll make note of that and follow up directly. The question here is regarding tire supply reporting and fees. So maybe you can just clarify for this person. So they're asking about when the tire audit report for supply reporting and the fees to be paid on May 31st, 2021. So that's the date that's outlined in the regulation. However, if you could speak to that further.
Yeah, so there will be a communication, I think, coming soon with updated timelines for producer supply reporting. So I think the performance reporting is still happening on schedule. I think that's mostly done through the pros. For the producer supply reporting for 2021, we will be in contact. You'll be receiving communications soon with an updated timeline for that. So it won't be May 31st because the fee isn't going to be set until the middle of May, but it'll be not too long after that.
Yes.
And similar for, I should note, similar for ITTAV and batteries. Again, the deadline in the regulation will be extended. I think I mentioned this already, to line up with when our registry is online. So we'll be communicating with producers and other registrants to make sure they're very aware of when those deadlines will be.
Great, thank you. How will you ensure E does not subsidize battery costs?
So we're really treating the E and batteries programs from an operational perspective as the same program. And this is in part because of the linkages between, the explicit linkages between the two regulations. Because there are obviously batteries is dealing with individually sold batteries, and then there are batteries embedded in electronic products. And operationally, we're treating them the same by putting registration and reporting on the same timetable. Registry Build is happening at the same time. There's overlap in the supply and logistics chains between the two product categories. So from an operational perspective, we are treating them the same, at least for 2021. And that's why the fee is combined.
Thank you. Next question, are the fees based on what we sold in the year in Ontario or when we import electronics?
That's a good question. I'm going to give you a short answer, which may not be too satisfying, which is that the fee is based on whatever is you're obligated to report to Ripra as your supply under the regulation. So I think that's a good but technical question about what you need to report into the registry. And we can help you answer that question more efficiently and more directly if you get in touch with our registry team. And maybe Jess, there's an easy email address to use that will get you in touch with us. Maybe Jess, I don't know if you have that handy, or they're able to easily find that on the website.
Yeah, I just like type it into person now. Yeah, so I've just sent it to you, but it's for anyone else wondering. It is registry@rpra.ca, and those go directly to our compliance team to help you with any questions you have. So for now, that's all the questions that are here. We still have time for questions, so please feel free to send them in. We'll take a quick pause from questions though, and just finish the rest of the presentation. Right now, I'm just going to launch a quick poll. This is something we do in all of our webinars as a way of just getting your feedback and understand a little bit better of how we're doing and how we can maybe improve our consultations going forward. So you should see a poll launched on your screen. There are 4 questions. Shouldn't take you too long, so I appreciate anyone who has the time to do this. I'll just give it a minute or so. All right. Thank you so much for that. I will just share the results quickly so people can see what everyone else was thinking. And again, we do this with all of our sessions, and we kind of compile this and think of ways to improve our sessions going forward. So if you ever have additional feedback for us, please feel free to let us know. We're always happy to hear suggestions. Thank you. Next slide. So this is just kind of closing the loop on the next steps. So as I mentioned at the beginning of today's session, that this recording will be posted to our website, as well as yesterday's and the presentation slides. So that can be found on our consultation webpage. And then the link is on this slide as well. We are asking that you submit feedback to us by Friday, May 14th. And that can be done through our consultations email address. Similarly, if you have questions about the proposal or would like to discuss it in more detail prior to that deadline, please send us an email at consultations, and we'll do our best to set up some time to chat further. As always, we will be putting together a consultation report, which summarizes feedback from the consultation period, as well as some, answers, provides Q&As from the sessions. So this will be posted alongside the final fees once those are finalized by our board. As Noah mentioned, that will be going to our board in mid-May. So once the fees have been posted, we'll be notifying stakeholders, including yourself, of when they've been posted. And then additionally, as Noah also mentioned, that we will be communicating directly to producers who have to be paying the fees this year, with more details on how to pay them, when to pay them, and just any kind of additional guidance that we can offer. And then we will be providing more information on that kind of phase 2 consultation on the proposed fees for Blue Box and HSP. And that will be happening once the regulations come out and are final. So stay tuned for details on that. In the meantime, I'll just check to see if we have any more questions. Okay, no, we have a couple more questions here. Can you please speak to what costs make up the majority of RPRA expenses? Also, what can a producer do to help control the RPRA costs passed on to them?
Those are good questions. The first one's maybe a bit easier. So you can take a look at our budget that is proposed in our business plan on our website. You know, each year we do a published business plan, which has our budget, and we also do an annual report, which has the actual financials from the previous year. And those can, you know, sort of itemize where the bulk of our costs are coming from. Most of the costs that go to a program are the shared costs involved in operating the program itself through, you know, a compliance and registry team, plus all the related support that team needs from communications, IT, finance, legal, and that kind of thing. Another portion, and that's the largest portion, another portion is direct costs that are charged to a specific program. I think the biggest part of that is typically the cost for the registry build. The registry build is a capital expenditure, and that gets amortized over time, over a 10-year period. So what gets reflected in the fees each year is just a portion of the total registry build for that specific program. But that's usually a smaller piece of the total program budget. Some of this detail will be in the next phase of the consultation, when you'll actually see how what the RRCA budget is for 2021 and how that gets allocated out to each of the programs. But at a very high level, that's what goes into it. Your second question about how to help reduce Ripra's costs is a good one. I don't think I have a good answer to that question. You know, the way that this producer responsibility framework is set up compared to the old model under the WDTA is that producers now should have more control over their costs for operating their total resource recovery program. So that's, you know, all the costs needed to, you know, fulfill their resource recovery obligations under the regulation. And those get negotiated out with pros, with processors, haulers, other service providers. That's the majority of the costs that producers face under these regulations is that total resource recovery cost. The Ripra fee is a small portion of that. You know, like I was saying before, essentially, Ripra, you know, operates on a pure cost recovery basis. So whatever our costs are for running the program in that year, that's what we need to recover from our registrants.
Thanks, Noah. Why do electronics producers have a minimum management requirement in the regulation, and how exactly does that work?
So that's sort of a policy question about the regulation itself. The way that the tires regulation, the batteries, and the ITT and the full electronics regulation, ITT-AV, and lighting when that comes online, the way those are set up is there's sort of two major aspects to the performance required under those regs. There's collection system requirements and management requirements. So there's an obligation to get a public collection system up and running and to manage what gets inputted into that system. But the government has also set minimum targets for minimum management targets to drive resource recovery or waste diversion results. So in addition to running this public collection system, there is an incentive, I mean, not just an incentive, an obligation to make sure that a certain percentage of what gets supplied into the province actually gets recovered. And so that sort of functions as a minimum. So you, in all of those regs, you at least need to manage that amount. If your collection system produces more than that, then you've got to also produce what gets spit out of that. If the collection system produces more than that, you have to also manage what gets spit out by that collection system, even if that is over and above your minimum target. But the targets set a floor. At least that's how we explain the government's sort of policy outcomes when we talk to producers and pros about how this framework is set up. For ITTAV and batteries, the first couple of years, I think, of the program, the minimum targets are explained as a best efforts target, and we have a compliance bulletin on our website explaining how we approach compliance when it comes to best efforts. There's still an obligation there. And then at some point, that best efforts target just becomes an absolute number target. I don't know if that was a helpful explanation, but if you have specific compliance related questions, again, feel free to use the compliance team email. And that's the best way to get in touch with the compliance team and to get answers to any compliance or registry related questions.
Thanks, Noah. There is a follow-up. Maybe you can just speak to it a little bit further. So what happens if we end up with a pro that is not compliant and we don't reach the minimum requirement?
So the way the regulations are set up is that the obligation always remains with the producer. So for tires, for ITTAV, and for batteries, it's fundamentally the producer's obligation. So the producer is on the hook, even if they've signed a contract with the pro. And so if there is a failure to meet performance obligations, it's the producer's responsibility to correct that. In terms of specific scenarios, it's hard for me to really comment on hypotheticals. But if you have a particular concern about how certain requirements or obligations will be met, then please reach out to the team and we can have a one-on-one chat. But the basic answer is that it's the producer's responsibility, and compliance is driven through the producers.
Another question here. Did RPRA look at leasing or modifying existing registration systems rather than a new build to help keep RPRA fees down?
We did. The Ripra did a lot of work looking at options for the registry build, in particular in 2017, when preparatory work for the registry foundational components was being done. And we had outside expert help to evaluate options. And it was determined that there weren't any systems that met the expected needs under the government's regulatory framework that they were giving us to implement. Really to achieve the goals of that of the RCA and those regulations, we needed to establish, we couldn't rely on any existing out of the box or complete systems, I should say. We did decide to build the Ripra registry on the Salesforce platform So we're getting the benefit of the functionality that's built into that platform that supports all of the registry components. That was a decision again made with outside expert advice back in 2017.
Thank you, Noah. So we do, there was another question that came in, but again, it's a bit specific to kind of their obligation. So I think it's best if we follow up with them directly. And so we'll take note of this person and their questions, and we'll get somebody from the compliance and registry team to follow up with you directly by email. And, you know, you can have a kind of more robust conversation with a member of our compliance team. I think that will be helpful. With that, it looks like there are no other questions. So Noah, do you have any final parting words?
I do not. Thanks for joining with me and bearing with me as I explain the proposal. And just as Jess mentioned, you still have an opportunity to give us feedback in writing or ask additional questions through the email addresses that you see on the screen.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you.